Yoav, this is an amazing film, Kol Hakavod. I know what we see on screen is not what you started out doing. And you mentioned, I think, at the beginning, it took like 10 years to get here, so like what took so long? No, seriously. What were the iterations that this went through from the original idea to morphing to what we ultimately see here tonight?
It's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to move through it relatively quickly. And to give you a roadmap of where we're going, you can think of a baseball metaphor. So we're going to go around the bases, back to home plate. So it all started when my colleagues, Anita and Aaron, who you see in the film, and they mentioned that they sort of brought me to the town because they were rededicating the Jewish cemetery about 9 years after they were run out of the town, right? And those events are recounted in the film. And so when they said, hey, do you want to come film this rededication of a Jewish cemetery, I was interested in part because I'd seen Fiddler on the Roof as a kid and felt like, oh yeah, Jews used to live in these little villages, and I'd like to go see whatever remains of a place like that. And I kind of immediately and instinctively upped the ante and said, if you're going to bring me all the way to Poland, why don't I spend some extra days in the town, try to talk to the oldest people there and ask them if they can remember when Jews were their neighbors, because this town was about 2/3 Jewish residents before World War II. And in so doing, I spoke to all of the elders in the film except the two most important ones, okay? There was no Pelagia yet, and there was no Yaakov yet. And it was the woman who remained in her doorway the whole interview. It was almost like the door was a little bit her shield, you know, and we knocked on her door, and she talked to us, but she never invited us in. But she never came out fully either. It was as if she wanted to be able to do a reverse Jack in the Box and just go boop, you know, if she felt like we pushed it too far. But she was the first one who admitted, yeah, Jews were murdered here 6 months after the war. And I had even heard that from Anita, but it didn't land in my heart until I heard it from someone who was alive at the time. And I think it was significant that she was Polish, not Jewish. So she was coming at it from a different perspective and with a kind of sense of guilt, as opposed to when a Jew tells the story, there's this a little bit of an axe to grind. And that just struck me as being so different and striking and sad and unique and it all just crystallized that this is a town with a rich, vibrant, shared Jewish-Polish past, and a dark secret about how all of that met its final ending. So that was first base. I'm going to pause at first base and mention that some clipboards are kind of come around now, which is my way of asking kindly, gently for your email address so that you can help vouch for this film. Because, as I mentioned before the film even started, there's a little bit of a resistance to seeing another Holocaust film. And what really helps get people to see this film is somebody who you know saying to you, you've got to see this film. It's not just another Holocaust film. It's really going to move you, trust me. And hopefully the film will come back to Seattle. As I mentioned, it's going to the other Washington next week, and once in a while we'll send you an email listing the different cities and places where it's going. So I've gotten you to first base.
So you go to first base. So what gets us to second base?
Okay. So for the next year, I'm really obsessing about this town. I'm finding out where can I get photos of this one little tiny town? And one of the places I contact in search of those kinds of records is the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. So they get to know me, and a year after it all began, they contact me and say, we've received a handwritten letter from an 85-year-old woman who says she spent a lot of her childhood in this town, and she saw the post-war murders there. She wants to come forward and tell her story now, and she wants you and us and anyone who can help her to find Yannick Weinberg, who she says is the son of 2 of the victims. So that was a big moment for me, as well as for the chief rabbi of Poland, because it's part of his job to track those stories and to know literally and figuratively where the bodies are buried. And so soon we were all following Pelagia down the dusty roads of Gniewyszew, getting her story, which kind of came flooding out of her. It was as if the floodgates of this woman's soul were opening up, because she was unburdening this trauma from that she had been carrying for 7 decades. And we found out that the reason she was coming forward now, like why then and not any decade prior, was she had learned through the grapevine that the ringleader of the killers had passed away. And this is what made her feel it was finally safe, because they had threatened her. He had threatened her. You know, you talk about this, you know what will happen to you. And she'd seen them kill 5 people. So now, it just so happened 1 year after I began, it was okay for her to come forward. Her hair was on fire to tell the story and hopefully to find out if Yannick survived. And on the one hand, she was hopeful and kind of needed for him to survive, and on the other hand, felt like it's impossible. He couldn't have. If he did, he would have surfaced at some point, because she did come back to the town. She no longer lived there, like basically right after the end of the war and right after she was threatened. She got the hell out of there. And she would only come back to visit and to ask about Jews. Have Jews been visiting? Have you seen any Jews? That kind of thing, like you see there's a scene where we sort of show her doing that as time is passing. She was specified to us, I never talked about the murders. I would just ask about Jews. And that's where she drew the line. And then to kind of come to third base was in editing her story and really being taken by her story. I realized, boy, this is a lot to process. It's really intense, but it's a lot for an audience to follow. If it's all in Polish subtitles, and all I can show you is her talking head and maybe some archival footage and maybe some footage of the town as it looks right now. And that pushed me to the point where I said, let's try animation. Let's see if that can get you where I want you to go, which is seeing that piece of fabric that she's talking about and being able to track her story. Because one of the things that I realized, and it took some time to realize, because like I said, her story came sort of gushing out of her and she was hopping all over the place in chronology as she told it. And so in the editing, I was sort of taking the pieces and putting them in chronological order, and then is when I really sort of saw the light and realized, wow, this woman's story, not only did she have an intimate eyewitness account, but like so many details track really well just from a narrative point of view. I mean, as an example, you know, she found the fabric shop really beautiful during the war, or excuse me, before the war. And then during the war, she actually snuck into the fabric shop to keep an eye on the boy. And also she ends up receiving this piece of fabric that she then later buries during the war to try to preserve it, and then unearths after the war as this memento of this whole story. So I felt like, wow, that all tracks so well, and yet without seeing it, it's gonna be hard to communicate. So anyway, that's what pushed to animation. That's third base. And then for the next 3 years, that's the story I was telling. Was essentially Pelagia became the center of the film. All the elders and the Friedman family became almost like a Greek chorus around her central account. And I thought, oh, it's sad we're never finding Yannick Weinberg. But I looked in the archives, and there was no Yannick Weinberg at Yad Vashem or the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum or the Shoah Foundation archives. And as I was, or so I thought, completing the film, I looked back at the printed program from the very first day in the town, which was that rededication of the cemetery. And on the cover of the program that Anita had made, she had placed this artwork that said, this is a painting of the marketplace by an artist named Harry Lieberman, who's from Gunivashed, from the town. And the more I learned about him, the more I realized, oh wow, this guy lived to be 102. He was kind of a human time capsule in that he grew up in the shtetl and then put it in his art and communicated it with color and vibrancy and authenticity at a point in time when no one could do that anymore. And he had a whole art career that began when he was 70 and continued to the end of his life. And I thought, okay, let's make a scene about him. And as you get a little glimpse of in the film, only by making the scene about him did I meet his 3 adult granddaughters who said to me, hey, we have a cousin who's still alive. You should really talk to him. And his name is Yaakov Goldstein. So that was how I found Yaakov. And when I found Yaakov, he was flabbergasted that anyone was making a film about his town. He had what I call his Casablanca moment, which was, of all the shtetls in Eastern Europe, this filmmaker walks into mine. But then his reaction was sort of this mix of anger and fear, and literally what he was saying to me was, the Polish people are talking to you? What are they telling you? Are they telling you it was only the Germans who killed? It was also the Polish. Are they telling you that? And so it was very intense, but I understood where his anger and fear were coming from, because I knew from his family that his parents had been killed in the same way as I knew others had been killed. And I just assumed it was a different set of murders that occurred after the war. And in a way to kind of prove to him, oh, I do know, and they are talking to me, I sent him transcripts of what Pelagia and Janina, the woman in the doorway, had said. And meanwhile, he sent me his memoir that he had written. So we're both reading each other's stuff, and I'm waiting day after day, really eager for him to respond and hopefully agree to be interviewed. At that point, he's in Israel, I'm in California, we're only meeting on Zoom or phone. And the more I'm reading his memoir, the more I'm thinking, holy shit, this man's story is incredible. I really need it in this film. And finally, after 10 days, he contacts me via email and basically says, Yoav, I'm sorry it took so long to respond. I was overwhelmed to read that this woman, Pelagia, saw the murder of my parents. And I am Yannick. And, for me, it was like,
You're getting verklempt, I can tell.
yeah, dropping the coffee cup moment, so to speak. And I also was excited, tremendously excited, like, this is the ending this film needs, that part of me was stoked. And another part of me was sort of just as kind of flabbergasted as he had been when I first contacted him. So then I knew this is home base, this is what we need, and the film that I thought was almost done was going to need to be taken apart, and the way I sort of visualized it was, okay, I've been building a bus in a garage for the last, at that point, 4 years. I'm gonna take apart the bus piece by piece and rebuild it as a double-decker bus. And it's gonna have a Yaakov level and a Pelagia level. And I naively thought it would only take a year, and then it took basically another 6 years to figure out how to put the story all together, and then all the animation was a huge endeavor, because we went from animating some of Pelagia's story to animating a lot more of it now that we had Yannick, and to animate all of Yaakov's story, which I had already felt was an incredible story that I had to tell even before I knew how it connected with Pelagius.
So I want to see if we can take a couple of questions from the audience. We ask for questions, not statements. If you'll raise your hand, Pamela will bring the microphone. While she's doing that, quick question. Can you talk to us briefly about the gravestones, just very briefly? And I know that's an important part of the film itself.
So the tombstones, those were in the backyard of Henrik and Sławomir, right? Father and son. Henrik, the old man, he was someone a lot of people, when we started knocking on the doors in Geneva, said, "Oh, talk to Henrik. He's the oldest man in town. He'll remember the Jews." So we interviewed him, and he, in a way, was typical in that he said things, on the one hand, like, yes, they were our classmates. Yes, my mother even spoke Yiddish. We interacted with them so much. Oh, no, killings of Jews that, aside from what the Germans did? No, that didn't happen. And we had his point of view in his interview, and I came back to the US and was editing with it, and then had a moment in the editing room where I was like, we didn't film B-roll of Henrik. In other words, we didn't film footage of him that was not interview. We just had his interview, and ideally you want some other footage to cut in with it. So the next time I went to Poland, we went and knocked on their door and explained, we don't need to interview him again, we just need footage of him doing something. And his son was like, I know just the thing. Grandpa, he was calling his own dad Grandpa likes to tend his flowers out back. Come on, I'll show you. And so the very first shot in the film, where the camera's like behind the old man and he's walking along the side of the house past rusted car parts and heaps of scrap metal, and then there's some tulips off in the corner. The only reason we were there was because of everything I just explained. But while we were there filming that shot, my cameraman kind of crept over to me, went like this, and then pointed, and there, with all the junk, was a Jewish tombstone. And now this is a year and a half after the cemetery had been rededicated, right? My first day in the town. And I had to sort of step into the film for the first time and say, well, why is this here? Can we please bring it back to the Jewish cemetery? And Sławomir, the son, clearly sort of took on the negotiator role on their behalf and was like, yeah, I bought it for pennies recently. And then as soon as he walked away, as you see in the film, his father told a totally different story. And then when he came back and we were trying to get it back to the Jewish cemetery, he would not agree to it, when he would do it, how he would do it. He was very kind of cagey about the whole affair. And we had to leave that day just hoping he would bring it back. And I think what happened was that over the course of all of our visits, not just me and the film crew, but also the Friedman family, coming back to that town year after year, we never delivered on their worst fears. There was never a moment where somebody came up with a stack of legal papers and said, your house belongs to the Jews, we'll see you in court. And there was never a moment where one of us got in someone's face and said, your father murdered my grandfather. We just kept coming back and asking, can you show us anything that was Jewish? Can you tell us any stories about when the Jews lived here? And I think Sławomir let go of his own fears, made the right decision, and not only returned that one tombstone, he knew who else had tombstones in their backyards functioning as little garden walls or stepping stones. So at the end of the film, the reason there's a dozen tombstones being loaded into that van was because he had gone the extra mile and convinced others, hey, let's give these things back, let's bring them back. And so that gives me hope that minds can be changed and that there's hope for this kind of story and even this film in this moment, because I'm just going to mention here, in case you haven't heard, the film has provoked a little bit of a shitstorm in Poland, because it had a national public broadcast in Poland this November, and within a matter of days, exactly who you would think would flip out, flipped out. And the ultra-nationalist camp of Polish politics launched a pretty aggressive campaign against this film specifically. And it's currently under investigation by sort of the Polish equivalent of the FCC.
Congratulations. I think this gentleman over here had his hands up. Can you shout out your question, please? That's a pretty big question. I think the question is like, throughout the rest of Poland, outside of here, what was the sort of situation like?
I mean, so to the first part, what this gentleman's referring to are things like, oh, Jews killed Christian children for blood, and then they put the blood in the matzah. It's just crazy ideas, but these ideas have been spread across Europe over a course of centuries, and including with some help sometimes from politicians, sometimes with help from the Catholic Church. It's all very unfortunate, but these crazy myths are out there. I think this village is actually a very good microcosm of what life was like in other shtetls, right, Jewish rural villages, if you're not familiar with that term, across Eastern Europe, whether it's Poland, Latvia, or anywhere kind of in that region, and which is to say, it's a mix of attitudes. There was a lot of positive relations and interactions, and I try to include that in the film and not be sort of one-sided about the whole thing. There was a lot of love and synergy between the Jewish communities and their neighbors, and a lot of interaction and a lot of richness and vibrancy there. And in fact, in Poland to this day, there's an expression in Polish, which I'm going to just only say in English, but basically the expression is, it's boring without the Jews. And it's an acknowledgement that in a way Jews were kind of like the pepper in Polish society, that it made things a little more interesting, that Jews, being a people who were already on the move and traveling, were bringing other things literally as merchants and figuratively in terms of culture to Poland, and having an influence on the art and the literature and everything else. And yet throughout all that, the anti-Semitism did surface from time to time, which is why once World War II happened, so much anti-Semitism that had been under the surface was unleashed in this horrible way.
So we need to wrap up. I'll just say, just very quickly, up until about 15 years ago, the Polish narrative was very clear. Poles were only victims in the Holocaust, never perpetrators. There was an incident that came to light, and in fact, there's an excellent film made about it. It's a fiction film called Aftermath, or Poklozi in Polish, well worthwhile seeking out. I want to say a huge thank you to Yoav for sharing your time and your information with us.
Please give a big round of applause, and thank you all for coming.